Chapter 1. Do you ever find yourself wondering why people make the decisions they make? If you ask an economist, she might tell you it all comes down to incentives. Or ask a philosopher and you'd probably get some kind of long-winded answer about the hierarchy of needs. And a scientist, well, you'd probably end up with a long spiel about how we're all just atoms on an unstoppable collision course with other atoms and how we make up meaning for decisions after the fact. I don't know what answer I subscribe to. I can't even tell you why I make the decisions I make, why I act the way I do. I don't even know why I think about this question so much. But I think in recent years, it's because of a man I met named Shay, and a story he told me about some doctors conducting experiments on kidnapped children. That story brought me back to my hometown in Alabama for nearly a year. In many ways, it's altered the course of my life. I'd like for you to help me understand why. But to do that, I'm going to need to start from the beginning. I'm Josh Webb, and this is why they left. Now, to start at the beginning, I need to tell you a little bit about me. I was a speech and debate nerd in high school, then I went to a private liberal arts college. The mantra there was go forth and change the culture, aka do whatever you want as long as it's big and significant. Unfortunately for me, my greatest weakness has always been uncertainty. So while my peers were heading off to law school or enrolling in PhD programs, I was working dead-end jobs in fields I didn't care about. This story, or my involvement with it, started in 2019. At that time, I was 23, living in North Carolina, working one of those boring dead-end jobs. And I was simultaneously desperate to do something new and different and meaningful, and totally unsure of what that ought to be. Then one afternoon, my phone started ringing. It was my brother Luke calling. What he told me went something like this. Actually, here's Luke. He can tell you himself.
I was at work, so I was working at UAB Hospital, which is like a big hospital in Birmingham. And one of my coworkers, Amanda, we were pretty good friends, and she was working beside me. The way that our job worked, you would work like directly beside another nurse. We were in the ICU, and we'd have like a long station of desks, and usually whoever you were beside them like for the whole day. And I remember she was like looking furiously on the computer the whole day, like searching stuff. And so around lunchtime, I was like, Amanda, what are you like looking into? Because this is like taking all of your time, and like I'm very curious about like what you're researching. And she started off on this story about how they had this compound behind their house, and there was all this like sketchy stuff going on behind it. And she was trying to find out more information about it. And then that sucked me into kind of helping her research that afternoon.
Let me take a step back and give you a little bit more context. Luke's coworker, Amanda, lived with her partner, Shay, in Hayden, a tiny town in Alabama about 45 minutes from where I grew up. Situated in Blount County, Hayden is a one-stoplight kind of place. Brick buildings, surrounded by forests and farms, everything's closed on Sundays, 30 minutes to the closest Walmart. You get the idea. To understand this story, I think you also need to understand Hayden. Shay has lived in Hayden nearly his entire life. Here's what he said about what it was like growing up there.
And the culture's a little monolithic in the sense that, it's just like, I guess, any rural or agrarian society. I mean, there's a certain group of beliefs or group of ideas or things you're supposed to adhere to, and so long as, you stay within that, you won't have too awful many problems. But, when you deviate a little in any bounds, be it any kind of cultural way, religious, any kind of transgressive art, clothing, whatever it is, you can get looked at like askance, I guess. So, it was interesting for me because, as both you guys know, I make a lot of what most people, I guess, would just call weird art, or I do sound installations, and I work with a lot of components of noise and modern composition techniques and stuff. So
I know what you're probably thinking. Southern accent, spent his whole life in Hayden, Alabama. How is this guy Shay throwing around terms like transgressive art in agrarian society? I don't know what to tell you. That's just who he is. Spend the day with him and you'll realize that he has an encyclopedic knowledge on any number of things. He's not someone you can put in a box. Anyway, back to Shay.
I always had a little bit of an awkward time being here, but also, I knew about farming and stuff, so I did have a somewhat of a connection point. But if it's not football, hunting, fishing, church, and there's only about 3 or 4 of those, which, not quantity, but I mean denominations. You got like Baptist, Methodist, whatever the non-denominational thing they say is, where they have rock bands and smoke shows on stage. And, the preacher's wife's got one of those like 5-carat cubic zirconia rings because, they're really doing good in the ways of the Lord. Or maybe Pentecostal or something if you're spicy. But every once in a while, a little snake handling too, but we don't talk about those people. That's the real hillbillies.
Shay's family has also owned land on the outskirts of town for decades.
My dad's side is rounders, as they're called in this area. I think I told you guys they've all passed away at this point through less than peaceful means. But my mother's side has a little bit different story, and they came here before it was actually a state. This was a territory when they first arrived, and
if you ask me to tell you about my ancestors or our family heritage with regard to land, I would give you a blank stare. But when you ask Shay, he could talk for hours and hours uninterrupted, and you'd probably be captivated almost the entire time. Again, that's just how he is.
My great, to the 7th grandfather or something like that, fell in love with this girl when they were of the age to get married, and his name was Joel Johnson, and he, I guess, fancied her so much that after, she left, he decided that he couldn't live without her. And so, he strapped on his 6 gun and threw a bag together of his stuff and hopped up on his horse and rode from North Carolina through the wilderness, Creek Nation, until he eventually found this place and this mountain and said he wanted to marry her. And I guess, cut open a space out of the forest, built a cabin, and they said, I do, and c'est la vie, here I am 200 years later. So
Shay's house is situated on a hill that looks down on several thousand feet of pastures. Behind his house, about 100 yards from his back porch, a deep forest begins, and Shay's land goes all the way back into those woods, too. Shay also owned another home on his land that he was, in 2019, renting out to some tenants, a husband and wife that he'd known for a long time. There was a catch with this couple, though. They were, to use the local term, meth heads. Funny thing about Hayden, when I was describing it, it probably sounded like an idyllic small town. Turns out there's more to it. Like a lot of seemingly perfect small towns, there are a lot of cracks just underneath the surface.
Okay, so in the scene that I've painted for you thus far, there's also another side to the community, because any community that's that closed off and what's the right word? That unified in their beliefs can also be very judgmental. And so there's a lot of things that exist sort of outside of it. And obviously, as everyone that's listening to this, I'm sure knows, meth culture is definitely one of those things that has invaded rural America. And anywhere that you can find farms with certain chemicals, you can find, meth heads in large quantities. And meth heads do really weird things in the woods that no one quite understands but other meth heads.
One night, Shay and Amanda were out on their back porch, and they saw what looked like pale white smoke rising above the trees deep within the forest. Something was on fire, and it seemed as though the fire was on Shay's land. Within minutes, though, the smoke had disappeared. So Shay and Amanda wondered whether they should do anything about it or not, but it was late, the fire seemed to have gone out, so they figured they'd just turn in for the night and look into it in the morning. The next morning, Shay went by his tenant's place and asked them whether they knew anything about the fire. He figured they'd been out in the woods getting high and had maybe started up a little campfire to keep warm. Or, if they weren't responsible for the fire, maybe they'd know who was. But when he asked them about it, what they said caught him completely by surprise. Oh yeah, it was probably those doctors that live out in the woods. What? What were they talking about? Nobody lived out in his woods. He'd lived on this land nearly his whole life. There weren't even any roads that led into that forest. But the tenants were positive. They insisted that there were doctors living out there. Oh, and the doctors had some kids imprisoned there too, that they were conducting experiments on. Now, at this point, Shay was more than a little dubious. Evil doctors and imprisoned kids. I mean, this sounds a lot like the kind of internet conspiracy theory you'd hear from someone on meth. But something about the couple's certainty stuck with him. So despite his skepticism, he decided to mount up on a four-wheeler and head out into the woods to see for himself if there was anything out there. And sure enough, he found something. A group of abandoned buildings way out into the bush that somehow he'd never known about. This was enough to get him thinking. Like any small town, Hayden has its share of urban legends. One story that's been passed around town for years involves a young girl. One night, so the story goes, a naked child shows up on someone's doorstep in Hayden, barely able to speak. In the homeowners rush to call the police, somehow the girl vanishes back into the woods before the police arrive, never to be heard from again. After finding the buildings and thinking about what his tenants had said, Shay remembered this story. His woods, in this set of buildings he'd never known about, were oddly close to the location where this girl had supposedly gone missing all those years earlier. Shortly after this, as Shay began researching these buildings and the story of the missing child, is when my brother heard about this from Amanda and then called me. I should tell you up front that I was a little hesitant to believe any of this story at first. One thing you should know about my brother Luke is that he loves conspiracy theories, though he's also a huge skeptic. He'll entertain almost any idea with an open mind, if only for the opportunity to point out all of the reasons it's silly or stupid. Aliens? Probably real. It's a huge universe, he'd say. But UFOs? I mean, why aren't there videos since everyone has cell phones? Bigfoot? Maybe, but where are the skeletons? Anyway, you get the idea. He also works in medicine, so he's sort of a walking contradiction, a conspiracy theorist who analyzes everything like a scientist. A part of me definitely wondered, as he was telling me this story he'd heard from Amanda, whether this was my brother's conspiracy side winning out, looking for something grand and dark and mysterious. I wondered when he was going to say, oh, and by the way, here's a reasonable explanation for the whole thing. But even after all these years, he's never been able to provide one. It's embarrassing to admit this, but from everything he told me, I was also excited. I didn't dwell much on how, if there was any truth to this, it meant that innocent children had been or were being hurt. Instead, I thought, wow, if this is legit, what a great opportunity. I mean, I'm a sucker for a good mystery, especially if it's a podcast. S-Town is, for my money, the best podcast of all time. Maybe this would be my own chance to do a little investigative journalism, reveal some horrible cover-up in a seemingly pristine small town, riff on Stephen King a little bit, reach thousands of listeners, and so doing catapult myself out of my mundane, ordinary life. But the cynical part of me was also aware there was a very good chance I'd start looking into this and it would quickly turn out to be a giant waste of time. Having listened to a lot of true crime, more than I want to admit, one thing I'm often disappointed with is that the mysteries just don't end up being all that mysterious. Within a few episodes, it's solved, and it's usually all a big misunderstanding. It's like a Scooby-Doo episode. The monster was just Mr. Jenkins scaring trespassers off his land. So I knew that this whole thing might not amount to much. It was possible this was just a bunch of rumors, my brother's imagination running away with itself, some abandoned old buildings in the woods, and the kind of stories people tell to impress their friends at the bar after they've had a few too many drinks. But I'm not giving too much away when I say that that's not what happened. The more I dug into this, it's only gotten more mysterious, not less. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. After that call from my brother, I knew this was too big of an opportunity to pass up. Either it was real, and there was a story here, or it wasn't, and it would at least be a nice diversion from my normal life. So I decided to take some time off work, and then I called up my best friend JR. I told him about the mystery, and he immediately wanted in. Then I packed up my old blue Ford Focus and headed home to Birmingham, Alabama, about 45 minutes from Shay's home in Hayden. JR drove up from Florida and met me in Birmingham. After we got to Birmingham, bright-eyed and full of optimism and misguided confidence, JR and I realized that we didn't exactly have a plan. Or if there was a plan, it went something like this. Number 1, confirm whether these buildings even exist. Number 2, if they do, figure out why they were abandoned. And number 3, catch the bad guys. Easy. I can tell you now there were several things we didn't think through. Like how if any of this was true, it could be dangerous. Or how if we're going to make a podcast, we should be recording everything, or at least making notes, neither of which we did. Or maybe that solving a mystery can often be much harder than it looks or sounds. We soon met up with Luke and took the drive out to Shay's place in Hayden. That drive was an adventure in and of itself. To get to Hayden from Birmingham, you head up Interstate 65 north, like you're headed to Tennessee. Then you pass a small town called Warrior, and you say goodbye to the state highway and hello to back roads. For another 15 or so miles, you're driving straight into the country. The odd building you see is either a Dollar General, shut down, or in total disrepair. Slowly, cows and hay bales become the only scenery you're going to encounter. Yet somehow, after what feels like forever, you make it to the town limits. Welcome to Hayden, the brown sign tells you. Population 1,500, although it feels like 150. Shay's property is right on the outskirts of town. You pull onto yet another side road, wind between trees and drive over gravel for probably another mile or two before beginning the journey up the hill his home sits on, overlooking lush green prairie and miles of forest. Shay told you about this land earlier, but I don't think he did justice to the fact that it's beautiful. This juxtaposition wasn't lost on me at the time, either. Such a beautiful place, such a short distance from something that supposedly was taking place in a really horrendous manner. We pulled up to Shay's place, and he and Amanda quickly came out to greet us. Shay was not what I was expecting. Before meeting him, I only knew a handful of things about him. That he sold produce, that he made music, that he'd lived in Hayden a long time. I guess I expected someone who was just a little ignorant from having spent their whole life in Hayden, Alabama. But the Shay I met then, that I've come to know, is anything but ignorant. Within minutes of meeting him, it became clear that this mystery had its very own John B. McLemore. After exchanging pleasantries, we all piled onto Shay's four-wheelers and began the trek out to the compound. We spent almost 30 minutes on those four-wheelers. It was a drive full of stops and starts over ruts, around trees, through thick branches, and uphill. I almost fell off probably about 3 times. Eventually, the brush got so thick that we abandoned the vehicles. This turned out to be fortunate, because then we found ourselves trying to navigate across a small river. After the river, we hiked for what felt like another hour, following no set path. The further we went, the more convinced I became that we were completely and totally lost, despite Shay's constant assurances otherwise. It was as if he alone was being led on by some kind of internal compass that pointed him forward, but was invisible to the rest of us. This wouldn't be the last time I felt like that with Shay, either. There's this sense that he can see something I can't. Like he has a certain faith in the serendipity of the universe to take him where he needs to go. I know that sounds like mumbo-jumbo. I can't really explain to you then what it was like. I can't now, despite having spent dozens of hours with him in the intervening years. While we walked, Shay kept a running, colorful dialogue that touched on anything and everything. The genus and species of flowers that we were walking by, or how the birds singing were definitely a distant cousin of the bluebird, you can tell by the pitch. Or about what's wrong with late-stage capitalism, or about the mysterious murder of his grandfather. Shay was captivating, and the deeper we got into the forest, which felt like 5 square miles or more from any other living person outside of our group, the more I thought that this trip was worth it just to meet him. He also filled in some more of the details about the story from his tenants as we walked. Supposedly, the kids that had been kept out here had fallen through the cracks of the foster care system. Then the government had lost track of them, other parties had taken advantage for nefarious purposes. In a strange way, all of this added a scary sense of possibility to the whole story. The foster care system across America is full of holes. Kids do end up in bad, unsanitary, or dangerous homes. The system does lose track. Was it really so crazy to think that maybe some of those kids could end up in a place like this? And what better place to hide than in the middle of a forest off the grid in rural Alabama? It's not exactly a state known for its stellar mental health services. I had a growing sense as we walked and talked that this whole story was somehow personal for Shay, too. It wasn't until years later that I confirmed this, as I learned more about his background. But soon there was no more time for personal reflections. Junk began to litter our path. Old tires, rusted out cars, briefcases and pamphlets, a car seat for an infant. And then we saw a house rising up through the trees. The first in the series of buildings that make up what Shay calls the compound. Because, in his words,
know what else you call like a group of houses in the middle of nowhere in the wilderness by themselves other than a compound.
The house itself was circled by a ring of debris. Children's clothing, piles of stuffed animals, cassette tapes and floppy disks and educational DVDs, plates and cups, gloves, reams and reams of paperwork of all sorts. It was as if the entire contents of the 3-story home had been expelled. Shay explained as we dug through the mess, curious at this wreckage of a past life. that it was far more destroyed than the last time he'd been out there months earlier. He quickly pointed to a few charred Pyrex pipes and several bunches of tinfoil laying around in the wreckage, common methods of smoking crystal meth. It must have been local meth heads that tossed the contents of the house inside out. It's hard to adequately describe this home to you. It carried with it an atmosphere that almost defies explanation. I don't want to be melodramatic. I don't mean to sound grandiloquent. But the house had a feel to it. What I want to tell you, but I'm afraid to fear of sounding silly, is that it felt foreboding. Maybe that was because of the story we heard ahead of time. Maybe we were primed to feel a sense of dread. Or maybe it was because the house was wrecked. Insulation was hanging down in pink, fluffy clouds from the ceiling. Furniture was broken into pieces and covered in what looked like years of filth. Spiderwebs were everywhere. Everything was desolate and destroyed. As we combed through the 3-story house, one thing was apparent. Almost no effort had been made to pack up and move out. It was instead like the inhabitants had simply stood up from dinner one evening and left, never to return, and taking nothing with them but the clothes on their backs. It was full of stuff of every kind. The stuff that constitutes a life. Dishes in the cabinets, silverware in the drawers, clothes in dressers, books in bookcases, family photo albums old enough that they were in black and white, candelabras and leatherback books that looked like family heirlooms. And there wasn't just enough stuff for a normal life there either. The building gave the impression that it had been some kind of medical office, or at the least that it had served some kind of medical function. I say this because of just how much medical paperwork and paraphernalia was strewn all throughout the home. There were bags full of pills, boxes and boxes of prescription meds, ledgers and sticky notes with pharmaceutical company logos, even stacks of script pads, the type doctors used to use to write medication orders before everything went digital. In what looked like an office space on the 3rd floor, we found thousands of pages of medical paperwork, binders and binders of it. Everything from treatment plans to drug trials to patient intake forms. And this wasn't just general information either. This was hundreds of patients' full names, birth dates, social security numbers, everything. I'm not a lawyer, but I remember thinking how strange this was. Luke and Amanda were both nurses at the time, and they couldn't quit talking as we combed through the paperwork about how it was illegal just to take patients' records home with you, much less abandoning them up to rot, or to whoever might stumble across them. As we went through this building, 2 names kept coming up, printed on dozens of pieces of mail we found all over the place. Anita and Dieter Weiss, addressed to 420 Watson Road. It seemed like a safe guess that the 2 of them were married, but it wasn't until later that, thanks to Google, we were able to piece together a few more things about them. Weiss was a German family name. Dieter and Anita had previously lived in Canada. Anita had worked as an office administrator at a business called Yap Psychiatric Services. And apparently Dieter had been in some kind of lawsuit with the Royal Bank of Canada. I told you about the medical paperwork and how much of it there was. All over that paperwork were 2 more names, Charles McIntyre and Marilyn Lockman. From the documentation, it looked like they were both psychiatrists who had practiced in Alabama. Strangely, their names were also listed on mail for the same address, 420 Watson Road. Like with Dieter and Anita, it wasn't until later that we connected a few more dots. Charles and Marilyn were married. Marilyn was Anita's sister, making Charles and Dieter brothers-in-law. We also learned that Charles and Marilyn had graduated from the same med school, the University of Guadalajara in Mexico. The last distinctive thing I remember about that first house was all of the kids' stuff. For starters, there were 2 rooms that were full of signs of children. Moldy dolls and broken toys, pink dresses and princess wigs and wands, and coloring books full of blue and green doodles outside the lines. Then there was the diary. We found a notebook full of entries from a young girl that, to protect her privacy, I'm going to call Abigail. Written in the messy hand of a child using pink ink, the diary was full of stuff that normal kids would write about. Trouble at school, crushes on boys, and not getting along with their parents. Well, at first, this felt like confirmation of the meth head story. Kidnapped kids and rogue doctors. We later confirmed that Abigail was actually Anita and Dieter's daughter. It seemed possible that Abigail hadn't been the only kid living out there, though. For starters, there were probably 50 pairs of children's shoes just laying around or buried under some sediment. And then there were sets and sets of gender-neutral clothes of varying sizes. All of that is pretty hard to explain for just one little girl. We finished going through that first house and moved on to the others, and while I want to tell you about them, really, it was more of the same. 4 more buildings full of signs of life in which the inhabitants had seemingly vanished without a trace, leaving every item in their possession behind. I'll quickly give you a rough layout, though. First, there was the 3-story house I just walked you through. Then, maybe a couple thousand feet away, with no discernible path between the two, deeper into the forest, was what I'll call the prisoner's house. We gave it this name because documents in the house indicated that it had been inhabited by several ex-convicts from Canada. What they were doing out there, or how they were connected to the 2 doctors, Anita and Anita, we had no idea. Past the prisoner's house, uphill, were 2 double-wide trailers. One of these was mostly destroyed by the time we got out there, but Shay filled me in on it later, on what he'd seen in it. I'll call it the lab. The other double-wide trailer looked like it had probably been Charles and Marilyn's home, judging off what we found inside. Then even further uphill, in the greatest state of disrepair, was the last building. It resembled a 2-story house. Shay discouraged us from going inside it, though. The last time he'd been in there, investigating the fire a few months earlier, it had been infested with about 15 different species of snake. Shay, of course, happened to know every distinguishing characteristic of each one. So, that's 5 buildings in total. The 2 double-wide trailers, one of those being the lab and the other being what we think was the home of the psychiatrists Charles and Marilyn. Then the 3-story house that I walked you through, home to Dieter and Anita Weiss and their daughter Abigail. And then there was the prisoner's house and the snake house. All of the buildings were in varying states of disorder and destruction, and all of them were full of the belongings of their previous inhabitants. And all of them, judging from the state of deterioration, had been abandoned for at least a couple of years. And again, we were out here in 2019. So they were abandoned potentially as early as 2015 or 2016. By this point, it was getting dark and it was time to get out of there. Nobody wanted to get stuck there at night. So we quickly made our way back to the 4-wheelers and then on to Shay's house, just beating the setting sun. As we sat on his porch drinking sweet tea, we decompressed, going over what we'd learned and what we thought of it. Those buildings existed. There were signs multiple children could have been living out there. There were indications that at least 2 psychiatrists had been living there too. There was all sorts of medication and treatment plans and exercise booklets, so it sure seemed like medicine had been practiced there to some degree. That or it was a storage or office facility. Whoever had been living out there, it looked like they'd left in a hurry. And they'd left a long time ago, at least a couple of years earlier. So whatever had been going on out there, it was over now. It was hard knowing what to make of all of this. I mean, on the one hand, there was no concrete proof that any kids, aside from Abigail Weiss, had ever lived out there, much less been kidnapped or experimented on. But on the other hand, what we'd seen did square eerily well with the story Shay had originally heard. It looked like there had been some doctors living out in the woods. It looked like there had been at least one child, maybe several children living out there with them. None of us knew exactly what to think. And in the midst of it all, in the midst of all of our discussion, I remember us coming back to this one central question over and over. Who would abandon their property like that? What would motivate you to just up and leave all of your stuff behind? That question has only gotten harder to answer as we've gained more information. In 2019, sitting on Shay's porch, what we knew was that none of us could offer any good reason why 2 practicing doctors would leave sensitive medical paperwork lying around for anyone to find. Or why a Canadian couple would settle down in Hayden, Alabama, sharing the property with a house full of ex-convicts. Or why any of these people would be living off the grid in a compound seemingly impossible to reach by any road. None of it made much sense. We definitely didn't know enough to warrant going to the police, but it was also bizarre enough that I think all of us wanted answers. Maybe I'm retroactively giving us noble motives, but I'd also like to think that each of us in that group felt some small amount of responsibility. Even if it was just a slim possibility that a child or multiple children had been harmed in some way out in those woods, that mattered. This mix of curiosity and obligation gave us momentum for the 2 weeks that followed our trip to the compound. We tracked down leads, we spent hours and hours on Google, researching names, dates, anything we could find. We connected some dots and made some discoveries. We even made a giant poster board at one point, the kind with the red yarn like you see in the movies and TV shows. I'd like to tell you that we doggedly pursued this for months and months and only let it rest after confirming that the rumors about children in trouble were baseless. But that just isn't true. 2 weeks passed, and then it was time to return to normal life. I was out of vacation time, JR needed a job, Luke and Amanda and Shay had partners, responsibilities, full-time jobs themselves. So many times life is just more complicated when you're the one actually living it. So I packed up my car, said goodbye to everyone, and went back to North Carolina. Back to that desk job I dreaded so much. And any time I felt a sense of guilt about how maybe I was abandoning people that needed help, I tried to convince myself of how unlikely that was. Kids in the woods? Evil doctors running experiments? I mean, come on now. Surely there's a reasonable explanation. Don't worry about it. Move on. And so I did. For 3 years, that's what I did. I moved to Florida, got a better job that I still didn't like, kept my head down, climbed the corporate ladder. Something happened, though, that disrupted that plan of living a normal life and forgetting the compound in the woods. Or rather, something kept happening. I kept thinking about it. I kept wondering, why did they leave? What would make people leave all of their belongings, all of that paperwork out in the woods to rot? Why, if Shay had spent his entire life on that land, had he never known those people were living just a couple of miles from him? Let me ask you this, and maybe it'll help you understand. Have you ever stumbled upon something so strange that you found yourself still thinking about it years later? I'm not talking about ghostly apparitions or lights in the night sky, just something that you couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for, no matter how hard you tried. That's exactly how this was for me. I couldn't quit thinking about it. The funny thing was, neither could anyone else. Every now and then Luke would mention it to me, and we'd toss questions back and forth about what had gone on out there. He told me later that he and Amanda, when their shifts overlapped at work, would do the same thing. And when he moved out of Birmingham a year or so later, they kept in contact, occasionally texting theories back and forth. Finally, after 3 years of this, I'd had enough. I brought all this up with my friend JR, the fact that I just kept thinking about this. And that conversation was like a moment out of a movie or a TV show. He'd been thinking about it too. He couldn't stop. He'd even been dreaming about it. And so on a muggy Florida night in August of 2022, JR and I made a promise to each other that we'd go back to Birmingham and treat this as seriously as it deserved. That in the off chance that someone or several people had been hurt by what was going on out in those woods, we'd find out, and we'd try our very hardest to get justice for them, no matter what the cost was. 3 years later, it was time to solve the mystery of those doctors living out in the woods. Time to understand why they left and where they went. Hey, before you go, here's a quick note on the road ahead. As I'm writing this, I'm deep into the investigation, and things are still unfolding. You'll have to be patient with me because it's going to take some time to finish it and then to write and record the next episodes. The best thing you can do while you wait is subscribe to this feed and leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow me on YouTube and TikTok at Alfonso Webb. That's ALFONSOWEBB. I'll be releasing some footage of what we found, as well as previews for upcoming content. And before I go, here's Shay and what's in store for you this season, as I catch you up on everything we've learned.
It appears to me like a bank robber from Canada who ended up being arrested by the FBI, lived there with a teen girl, and had prisoners who worked for him from prison who traveled back and forth from Florida to California regularly while making stops here in central Alabama, with 2 doctors on the property overseeing it, and then either some population group of children who need help and or old people who need help. And I think that's the main thing of concern. I think you could pretty much say in that general compound everything from stripping copper and cooking meth to exploiting children took place at some point. And I think that if there were people involved in it who have not yet been come to call, then that needs to happen, and it's been long enough.
Why They Left is written and produced by me, Josh Webb, with production assistance and writing help from Luke Webb, and our original theme song is from Shay Stevenson. And special thanks to Jared Leslie for his help in the investigation.